Welcome to Pet Business Disruptors. I'm Clayton. I'm here today with Caroline Griffiths, who is a pet nutritionist consultant, a former pet nutritionist at Nature's Menu, and also the person behind the Natural Dog Expo. So welcome to Pet Business Disruptors, Caroline.
Hello. Good to be here. It's very professional.
Well, yeah, like me. Everything Brilliant. Apart from me is professional. So, yeah, no, you came a long way to see us today. So thanks for taking the drive up and coming up.
Travelled through snow and ice. And
and
made it.
Blood and bones and everything. So tell us all about your history, Caroline, because I know before we start like getting into the meat of like, us ragging each other about nutrition, like tell us about how you sort of became what you are within the space and how you ended up being the nutritionist at Nature's Menu and that sort of stuff.
It's a long story. It's sort of
we got time.
25 years.
We got time. We
have. Okay. Well, I'll try and be a short potted version because many people have heard it before as well, but started working in a kennel cattery when I was 16. And at that time, my mum was a vegetarian and had convinced me, and I was a vegetarian at the time as well. And the lady who ran the kennels on my first day, she pulls out this rack of ribs and she says, I want you to split this up for my Pyrenean mountain dogs, because we also at the kennels had Pyrenean mountain dogs and Lhasa Apsos that were bred and used to go to Crufts and all the different shows. In fact, used to come to Peterborough and do the show here, actually. So that obviously went down like a ton of bricks, and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I didn't even want to touch it. But she, over the years of working with her, this lovely lady, Dawn, taught me how to feed dogs properly, really, and got me on the roll that I'm on, that I've not stopped rolling. I'm passionate about canine nutrition and dog food. So I soon learnt how to feed raw meaty bones. I soon learnt about the way that this lovely lady raised her dogs naturally and the different options that she chose. So it was very integrative. It wasn't against veterinary medicine, but we would integrate herbalism. We would integrate, under the guidance of a lovely vet, and homeopathy. We had a lovely vet near us at the time called Chris Day, who sadly died now, but he's left a legacy of knowledge with a lot of people, wonderful man. So we were very integrative, and that really started the process of me wanting to learn more, because over the years of working there, it's a cliche, but it was the dogs and the cats that taught me the most, because I saw them heal. And I would see them heal on things like homeopathy, where they had been on traditional veterinary care initially, maybe several times. So for instance, like allergies, classic one, a lot of the time they'll come up at spring. So with it being a kennel cattery that people would go on holiday or business trips or whatever, and they'd come into us, we saw these animals regularly. So one year we'd see them and they'd have the steroids. The next year they'd have a different veterinary med. And then the next year they'd say to us, well, Monty doesn't have this now, and he had this last spring, I'm sure, and we would say, oh, well, Monty has this homeopathy. So we would guide them. And then the next time the dog came in, the dog would be not itching and wouldn't have these symptoms, in a sense, had got better and had got over that condition. So I started thinking, well, hang on a minute. I'm literally seeing the ones that have the natural options get better and the ones that don't continuously every year having the same ailments. So these are the kind of things that I witnessed and observed. So in my own way, it was like a bit of a science data collection. Never wrote any of it down, of course, but I have so many stories. I often think I could write a book about the stories. We had if you don't mind me ranting on about it. We had a lovely greyhound. I never forget her, because she was one of the few greyhounds that I've met that wasn't an ex-racer. So she wasn't a rescue greyhound. She was actually taken to shows, and she started to lose the fur, particularly on her back, either side of her spine. And anyway, they had all sorts of treatments. And this dog didn't come in that often, to be fair. So I didn't see her that regularly. But when I did, I could gradually see over a couple of years it was getting worse. And I suggested that they looked into adding something to the food. So the food they were on was a supermarket brand. It was just a classic multicoloured dry, and then they were adding some tin to it as well. So I suggested that they added some supplements. And at the time I was big into green supplements, which I still am. So I had started then my nutrition qualification. So I suggested chlorella because I thought, well, let's clean this dog out a bit. And that was just enough for the hair to grow back. And that had been years. And the vet had even said before that the hair follicles had died and that the hair follicles were never going to come back. She was never going to be a show greyhound again. And yeah, she had this chlorella powder for, I would say, probably about 3 weeks. And then they were on the phone saying, I don't know what you've done, but this is, and I said, well, it's not me. I said, I've just helped her body to clean itself out of anything that could have been in there. And perhaps added some nutrition that was possibly missing from the processed diet, which I'm sure we'll come to. It's one of my favourite subjects. What could be missing from your processed diet for your dog or cat? But yeah, so this lovely greyhound got better. And the funny thing was, I had no idea what these people did for a living because I didn't particularly ask them when they brought in their dog when they were going away. But it turned out they were dentists, and they said to me, this dog has got the cleanest breath now. And they said, so we are now recommending this supplement to all of our clients, all of our dental clients, because we can see how much it helps. So it was just, yeah, quite funny, to be honest. Loads of little stories like that, which I often, as I said, I think I could put into a book one day. But, you know, I'm so busy with the nutrition. It just is, oh, goodness me, so many. I mean, it's nice to be busy, but on the other hand, it does mean there's lots of poorly dogs, which isn't what we want, is it?
I think the trouble is, I think there's a lack of information out there, or I think it's very confused, the information.
Too much, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, and I think everybody has their own take on it and that sort of stuff. So, so you also became nutritionist at Nature's Menu. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I worked for them. I helped in the marketing and as a nutrition consultant and their nutritionist for a while as well. Also organising events. Myself and the MD at the time, we had he really wanted to amalgamate the companies that he had to make it easier, and we came up with Raw is Best, and we led this Raw is Best campaign, which meant that Nature's Menu were able to go to Crufts for the first time. And this was, I'd say, time-wise, maybe 11 years ago, something like that, around that time period. And that really stamped Raw on the UK pet food sector. It really opened up Raw a bit more to the Guardian by going to Crufts and having these big campaigns.
Because it was funny, because Raw had dropped off the map completely. So if I went back to when I was young, I grew up in the pet shop, and we used to sell cheek, tripe, chicken hearts, lamb's hearts, lamb's tongues, all this sort of stuff. And then over time, it just ended up being tripe and variations on that and free flow. And gradually over time, we went from, I remember my parents' pet shop had two walk-in freezers. We used to sell enormous amounts. Mm-hmm. But then by the time I was sort of out of a pet shop at 18, so we're going back to mid-90s now at this point.
Yep.
We had one freezer, and that was it, one chest freezer, because the raw food market had just dropped off, and there were so many pet shops. So when I was wholesaling, there were so many shops I used to deliver to who just didn't even have frozen food, full stop.
Yeah. And
we've sort of done this full circle where now suddenly you can go into raw food shops, and as wholesaling, I sold loads of natural treats, and my spike in sales was all coming from raw food shops opening up all over the country. I had some great ones I used to deal with, Raw Pet Supplies in Cardiff, and the Dog's Diner in Liverpool.
Yep,
and
still going.
Yeah,
they're great.
And they're all still and there was loads of Nurturing by Nature. I was dealing with them when they were first going, down in sort of not your neck of the woods, but sort of PO postcode somewhere. But like I had loads of these sort of guys sort of spring up and they've got bigger and bigger. So it's interesting how, and I think Nature's Menu probably was a big part of that, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they made it easier for people. Yeah, and it was available in so many local pet shops then. So it was, again, back in the game. So it was back in the stores again. And
the nuggets idea, although like anyone who feeds raw now, like nuggets aren't ideal. But as a starter, as sort of like an easy move into raw, they were a great idea because people could just pull out the amount of nuggets they need, put it in, let it defrost and feed it. I mean, nowadays, I think it's not that necessary because I think the market's matured a lot. Yeah. But it's interesting how things have moved across in that sector.
It has, yeah, because I can remember in the days when I was asked to split the rack of ribs, we did just feed raw meaty bones and tripe. That's what we fed. And we fed some vegetables as well. But then, you're right, it did change, not particularly for the dogs that I was caring for in that environment, but for the dogs that were coming in. So the ones where the owners had gone away, they were on more and more different types of processed dog food, shelf-stable dog food, whether that was tins, whether that was pouches. And we used to have the plastic tray ones back in the day, Nature Diet as well.
Well, I dealt with Nature Diet when they were a frozen food company. I don't know if you know, but they were actually SCC Meats, and then they became Contented Pet Foods. So there was a number of Contented Pet shops as well they had, and they were a frozen meat company. And then he came out with Nature Diet and went all in on Nature Diet and got rid of the frozen side of the business. But actually, just like dog food generally was different then as well, because I worked for Gilbertson Page. So like Value Mix, and Value Mix was I
remember Value Mix.
That was like the big dog food.
Yeah.
And it was like, I mean, you look at it now and it's like muesli, and they were next door to weetabix. So they used to get all the weetabix stuff. And so it was like flake maize. And I mean, you remember Selection 7? That was another great one. And overnight the market just changed into kibble. Like �𝐷𝐿 really, I think, ushered that in, because before that it was like you've got your Value Mix, your Vitalin, your Wilson's with gravy, those kinds of products. Then you had Phoebo. Phoebo was kind of like a mid-tier product, so kind of an exclusion, but they were big old balls, if you remember.
And Oscars.
Yeah.
Do you remember us? They used to do the little shows.
Yeah, but they were like, see, from a pet trade perspective, they weren't in the shops because they were kind of like franchises, area franchises. But what changed it was actually 𝐷𝐿. So when 𝐷𝐿 first came over, and you actually then had like these really strong smelling meaty dog kibbles, it just blew everything out of the water. And I remember Gilbertson Page, if they didn't come up with Dr. John's, they would have gone down the tubes, and they had to change their whole business model, because suddenly Value Mix went from being the big dog food in the pet industry to suddenly no one buys it anymore. And it was all to do with this like fast transition from mueslis or frozen meat and terrier meals. And like, I mean, you think about it, when I was a kid, we were feeding tripe with terrier meal, and then we used to put SA37 or seaweed powder on top.
Yep.
And that would be how we used to feed our dogs. And I don't think we're a million miles away from that now, to be honest.
It's come a full circle in a way. Yeah. Well, we used to use a lot of Dean's supplements, which is a fantastic book. Anyone that likes dogs has to read Buster Lloyd-Jones' autobiography. You'll find it on Amazon for like, I don't know, £1 or something. It is so good though.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I remember Dean's, because they used to sell tin food as well.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, and lots of lovely herbal supplements. Yeah. He was a holistic vet.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it has come a full circle in a sense, hasn't it? So I think there's a lot of people who are still were raw feeding then, and have continued and have seen it change and seen it get more commercial, and perhaps haven't been happy with that. And they're still doing what they've always done, which is the tripe and the raw meaty bones. But there are a lot of people who have been involved in the commercial, and they fed the commercial, and then they're moving on to the tripe and the raw meaty bones. So they're going more DIY. I think a lot of it is how the trends and the changes that are happening with pet food, a lot of it has to be marketing. And then, of course, it becomes like a thing to do. Well, so-and-so's doing it, so I'm going to do that. And that's one of the things that I'm not so keen on with raw feeding, that people just do it because they think it's the thing to do. Because what often happens then is it's done without an understanding of how to feed it appropriately. They don't necessarily know exactly what's right for their dog as an individual, and they don't really understand what raw food is. So they just think it's this new thing that's suddenly available. And for me, the magic of raw food is the fact that it is evolutionary and historically what the dog's gut system is used to eating, or any carnivorous being on the planet. And what that means for me is that we're honouring nature, because I think for farming in general, certainly for our food, there are big changes happening on the planet because we've moved away from honouring nature. And when we honour nature and we can understand about things like the soil and the importance of the water that we're drinking and the importance of the air that we're breathing, and all these just what we take for granted that are actually really, really suffering at the moment on this planet. For me, fresh feeding, so even home cooked, isn't about raw necessarily for me. It's about understanding about whole foods. I mean, have you read Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tulleken? Well, he talks a lot in his interviews about how there's been studies showing that when you eat an apple whole, it's actually better for you and better digested than having it pureed or having it cooked into applesauce, that kind of thing. So there's something to be said for eating whole foods. And I think that for me is what we have to understand that raw is. Raw isn't this other way that suddenly appeared to feed that's going to solve all problems. You're feeding whole foods. You're feeding natural foods. That's what you're doing. So if you feed that, if you find that raw doesn't work for you, I would say go to fresh cooked. So go to lightly cooked as the second option, because one of my bugbears is that if raw doesn't work, people hop straight back to processed food without trying the middle option, which could actually be the way forward for the dog. And it has a lot of the attributes of raw, most of them, really. Yeah,
I mean, what's your, because obviously kibble has become like the enemy of certain people, I think, but what's your opinion on something like cold pressed as in comparison to, let's say, a fresh cooked food?
Well, it won't have the same attributes.
Yeah.
It won't have the same attributes and no shelf stable food will have the same attributes as a whole food.
Yeah.
You can get ones that are closer, and some of the attributes will be there. I mean, cold press came about because the general marketing around that was it was higher in essential fatty acids because it didn't have that last heat cooking process, because obviously it's pressed, so it's more of a pellet, rather than the extruder, which needs heat to even occur for that to happen. But it's still predominantly made with meat meal that has had those heating processes. So it's not just packed with omegas. And I mean, I don't know how you feel about the marketing and the labeling laws, but I've over the years learned that there are quite a lot of loopholes in these marketing. So you can say, for instance, if you pack your kibble or you pack your cold press with fish, if it's the high fish content, you can say salmon rich in omega-3 all over the packaging. And the Guardian feels that they're buying an omega-3 packed product when actually it was the salmon prior to cooking or prior to being made into meat meal that had the omega-3. So for me, I think we need more understanding. Well,
an interesting one actually is which I have a weird thing about it when it comes to kibble is there's become this trend towards, let's say it's a 40% meat product or 60%. It will be 20% fresh meat, 20% meat meal. Now, number one, it's all going through an extruder.
Yeah, you can't put fresh meat in a cold pressed. Yeah, it has to have a drying process.
No, but I'm talking for a kibble even, but it's still going through the high heats and all the rest of it. But the only difference is if you're putting fresh meat through, you're just going to lose all the water. So actually, you're not getting 40% meat at all. You're actually getting most things are 60%, 70% water.
Dehydrated meat.
So you're only going to get a third of that. So if you've got put 30% fresh meat and you're only getting 10%, if that makes sense.
Of the actual meat. Yes.
So it's a kind of a weird, like, yeah.
It doesn't always make as much sense when you break it down, does it? And also don't forget the lipid hydration, the fats.
Yeah.
They're really key, you know, and we're not just losing the water when we make meat meal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, okay, so number one, before we go on, like, before I let you go on a rant about kibble,
I would never do that. No, I wouldn't, honestly.
No,
I don't feel the need necessarily.
I mean, so first of all, because if we compare, let's say, raw food to fresh, lightly cooked fresh food,
yep.
What is there like nutrient loss between one to the other? Like, so let's say I've got a kilo of raw food, and let's say I cook it and it turns into whatever weight that would turn into, maybe 850 grams of fresh food. Is there a nutrient loss from one to the other? Is there a benefit to doing one thing over the other? Is it better to give the raw? Is it better to give the lightly cooked food? Where would be the sort of pros and cons in that?
Okay, so one of the reasons I say that fresh lightly cooked is a really good option instead of hopping straight to processed is because fresh lightly cooked has pretty much all the things that a raw would have in it. Now, obviously, it's going to have slightly less moisture. The fats will be slightly heated, but nowhere near the temperatures that will denature them. Or turn them into trans fatty acids, which can happen with processed foods. But obviously you can't cook bone. So you're losing that bone matrix. So yeah, when you lose that, then you're compromising the minerals in the food. That's the primary thing that you're compromising. So you do have to find a way to add that back in to a lightly cooked food. Now, most of the commercial brands, because they're commercial, they're obviously governed by the laws of animal additives in pet food. So they can actually only add calcium carbonate, which is chalk. So they have a low bioavailability calcium. They do add the other minerals because bone isn't just made of calcium. Calcium is a bit like the bricks, and then the mortar is all the other bits and pieces that you need. So the magnesium, for instance, calcium needs magnesium to function. They're pretty good friends in the body. They don't really do much without each other. So things like that are added as well. So that's why you tend to see additives then in the commercial brands. Now, if you went to, say, a nutrition consultant like myself or one of the APNC members, then they would be able to teach you how to make a lightly cooked food that would have that bone matrix mineral content back in it. And one of the ways is to add bone meals at a certain rate. I'm actually looking into antler powder as well, because that has a good ratio. It's really good. So you can, but it also, you've got to think as well about what the stool quality is going to be. So it isn't necessarily always about, can I get the exact nutrition? You've also then got to be thinking about how does that act in the body and what's the stool quality going to be. You know, could the dog even have the bone meal? I mean, for many years we only had beef bone meal, and if you were dealing with a dog that had a beef allergy, you were pretty stuffed. But now you can actually get horse bone meal and you can get rabbit bone meal. So these are new on the market, fairly new in the UK. So there are ways to do it, but there isn't a lot of loss. If you're doing it in a balanced way, there isn't a lot of loss.
But to do that, you would have to do it yourself, right?
You can buy them, as I said, commercially, but they don't have the bioavailability. But I mean, it's not to say that I don't recommend them. So there's one particular brand in the UK that doesn't have any lectin-based ingredients and phytic acid-based ingredients. So I do tend to recommend those over the other ones, the big, really big, well-known commercials.
Which one's that?
Am I allowed to say? I wasn't sure that I'd be allowed to.
Like, I tend to avoid saying people's names.
Well, do you know, I've tried to talk to these people and explain how often, as a nutrition consultant of the last 15 years, I have suggested their product and I've never heard anything back. So I'm not going to give them the PR, actually. But I'll tell you, it isn't any that have got the lectin-based phytic acid products in them. So you don't want lentils.
Yeah. No, I mean, I only drop people's names out if I'm going to say something negative. I know if I'm saying something positive.
They're great for my clients, but I just think actually.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, if they're not going to engage you and you're pushing work that way, yeah.
All the time. Yeah, but it's because they're pretty much the only ones I would trust for that reason, because of the ingredients that they've chosen and the nutritionist that they worked with. I know her from years back, and she's a really nice girl.
So when you say, like, do you mean things like red lentils?
Yeah, what they do, you see, is they make the food on a commercial level stick together better. Right. So that's why they're used. And they do obviously have prebiotics, and so you can make an argument that they're okay in that way. And, compared to some of the other ingredients in other foods, then, they're not this awful, never feed. Like, if you have to feed that occasionally, fine. But if you're going to come to me, I'm going to tell you the optimum diet, because that's what I'm trained to do. Yeah.
So if people are looking like at raw food, because obviously there's a lot of brands now, and you've got stuff from the cheap 80-10-10s all the way up to, like, so one of the brands I use Nutriment. I use the low purine, because my oldest dog, she's had bladder stone problems and urinary tract problems. So we she's 14 now, but she gets the Nutriment low purine food.
Okay.
But obviously, again, there's like a lot of brands. I feel like Donald Trump, a lot of brands, but there's a lot of brands, and like, how do you go? Well, this is the right one. Yeah, where do you start? Yeah. I mean, because I feel like with kibble, people are better at putting their USPs across. They're better at, like, saying, well, this is for senior dogs because it's got X, Y, and Z in it. Whereas raw food, it's a lot less targeted. It feels that there's, and even when it is targeted, it's targeted poorly.
I think that's just, it's getting more and more commercial. So the targeting will happen. The targeting's a commercial marketing aspect, really, because a lot of the things that they add into a senior dog's diet would already be in a fresh diet, you see. So the fact the dog's missed out on them for such a long time, when they get older, it shows a bit. So they put it in the food. So that's the kind of example. And the puppy guidelines aren't massively different. Yeah. They're not massively different, really. I mean, that you do obviously have to have, the biggest differences are in the macronutrients with the puppy foods. But so generally speaking, a raw diet is okay for puppies, because it would still hit the targets of the...
When you say the macronutrients, you're talking about protein and fat. Protein and fat.
Yeah.
Just obviously so people know.
Yeah. But sorry. Yeah. No,
but the funny thing is like, we used to do that, like, so, going back, it was always like small dogs need more macronutrients than big dogs, for example. So higher levels of protein, higher levels of fat, because they, if you're a Chihuahua, per kilo, you're running a lot more than, let's say, a wolfhound. So, but then
so you adapt it. Yeah. Well, I mean, that is within the guidelines. There is a bit of a difference in terms of the weight of the dog, but generally speaking, the guidelines are just the same, pretty much. There's a big grey area between minimum and maximum.
So when it comes to, obviously, another trend within raw food is like the additions of supplements, and that's kind of bled into the whole industry. Like, so I read a report in 2020 about how the supplement market was going to blow up, and it's gone crazy since then, obviously. Because, I mean, if you look at what we had before, other than, let's say, Dor West and Dean's years ago, I mean, Dor West have been like the constant doing it fairly well. But then you have to go back to like SA37, which no longer exists, and things like seaweed powders and that sort of stuff. And then outside of that, it was like things like VitaPet and stuff like that, which was kind of, it's fairly old hat at this point. Like, how do you feel about supplements and and how you'd use them?
I think they're really useful if they've got a purpose, and then you stop using them when you've achieved the purpose. But I will say as well, if you're feeding just an 80-10-10, you will need to be adding things, especially if you're going by the guidelines, and they're all we've got to go on. Yeah. They're not great, but they are all we've got to go on. So if you wanted to hit the FEDIAF targets, for instance, the nutrition requirements there, you would need to probably add some kelp, actually. You would likely need to add something that's got a vitamin E content. Now, if you're feeding a grass-fed, grass-finished beef, for instance, or a wild-caught meat, then you might not need to add as much vitamin E because it's in the meat, because they ate the grass, so it's passed through. So, but you don't know that necessarily when you're buying the food. So you probably would have to add bits and pieces. I mean, I won't go into the whole what you add. So that's for another podcast or it's for a consult. But, you will have to add some bits and pieces. So but I would say always add whole food. So things like kelp are great. Things like wheatgrass are great because they're a food.
Yeah.
I think that just in the same with us as well. Like everywhere you look, there's supplements for this and supplements for that. They've all got, like you said, these big USPs, and you think, oh goodness, I need that. You could make an argument for it. Back in the day, I worked a lot with Catherine O'Driscoll. I went on her workshops and learned from her. And she used to give us a sheet with all the different nutrients, like, all your B vitamins, all your vitamin D. And there would be like a list of what symptoms you would have if you had a deficiency of this nutrient, and all the minerals as well. You could make an argument reading it that you were deficient in all of them. It just sounds awful. You think, oh goodness, I sometimes get that. And before you know it, you're on all sorts of supplements. So I think, again, it brings it back, like, what would nature do? What does nature provide? How does nature answer this? How does nature rebalance herself? And I would look to that all the time because nature had it covered before we got involved, really.
So I'm just going to hit you with some criticisms that I've heard about raw.
Oh, absolutely. Go on then.
Right. So number one is like the fiber aspect. A lot of raw foods don't contain enough fiber to hold it in the gut long enough. And it can pass through the system, and the micronutrients won't be absorbed as well as they could be.
Okay, is this who's?
No, this is
a new one, but I have an idea of why that might be. So, a lot of the micronutrients will be utilised, absorbed, digested, if you like, using the microbiome.
Yeah.
So like vitamin E is linked with E. coli. The good strains of E. coli are linked with vitamin E production. B vitamins are made in the gut. If you don't have enough of them, if you have a certain biome ecosystem, it can make some to sustain you. So you wouldn't necessarily need it to be in the gut for that long. You would just need to have the relevant biome to be in there. Now, biome loves prebiotics. They're pre-biome, so they feed and become the biome. Okay, so the biome can proliferate the good ones if it gets the right food. So that could be possibly where that argument comes from, that if you haven't got enough fiber, you don't have enough prebiotics, and thus you don't have a decent microbiome. But there's so many more threats to microbiome now. I think fiber or fever. So I was about to say,
fever.
It's
that's the French way of saying.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah. We all need more fever. Yeah. So I just think that's probably where that's come from.
No, look, these are just criticism. Look, the big one I hear, and so I have a friend who teaches nutrition at veterinary college, and she is anti-raw food, and you can probably guess what the reasoning is, but she says about the salmonella side of things and the health hazard that goes with it.
So firstly, I would say if she's still pro-fresh cooked, big tick for me. Right. If she leaps over that and goes straight to process, she's missed the point of raw.
Yeah.
Okay, because this versus argument really does split, and it pulls us away from who we truly are as human beings as well. So going back to the bacteria again, it's in there. Okay, now this is why we have such strict regulations to minimize it, reduce it, inertia it by freezing, all the different things that we do. I would hazard a guess, having worked in the manufacturing of raw, but not in human meat production. But when you go and buy meat from a supermarket and you find it on the fridge shelf, that is not going to have as much inert bacteria as the one that's like when it's frozen. So if you're shopping in farm foods in Iceland, you're probably getting better hygienic meat. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So the people that say about the bacteria are still going and buying meat themselves from a fridge, not a freezer, which is then likely to have the bacteria on it. Now, the argument is then, okay, because it isn't just in pet food meat. We don't have a lesser quality meat. It's just different parts of the animal. Yeah. So the argument then is that there's a kill step that happens that when we put it in the oven or we fry the meat off, okay. But the dog, if they're healthy and have a decent stomach acid, have that kill step within their stomach acid. Now, many dogs aren't healthy for various reasons, not just diet. So they may not have enough stomach acid, or not necessarily enough, but it may not be of the quality it needs to be killing off this bacteria for any number of reasons, sometimes just stress. So then you might see that the dog reacts to a bacteria in the raw meat. But another thing to say about it, there's a lot to say about this side of things, is that there have been 2 big studies looking into the cross-contamination of possible pathogenic bacteria from raw meat, okay, the transmission of it in households. And both studies came back that it was either low or rare. So there's actually no science that says that it will be transmissible, even if it is in there, like trouble-causing transmissible, okay? Because we will practice hygiene as well when we're handling it, just as you would do with your own meat. So yeah, it's a case of fear over truth, I think, because it's in there. No. You know, there's going to be, but we live in a bacteria-rich world. Dogs live in a bacteria-rich world. They're licking each other's anal glands all the time. They're, you know, licking from the puddles. They're rolling about. You know, this is going to happen anyway. The second, well, I've done about second, probably more like about fifth now, isn't it? So I'm very good friends with a really nice lady who runs a microbiome lab. And she said to me recently, and this is a fun thing, actually, I'm excited to share this. It's a new thing we're going to be doing in May this year. So she said to me recently, what's interesting is when I do mouth saliva swabs of raw-fed dogs, they have less pathogenic bacteria than when I do mouth saliva swabs of kibble-fed dogs. So in effect, the kibble-fed dogs have higher periodontal disease, which means that they have a more pathogenic, in a sense, more opportunistic bacteria that's proliferating in their mouths. So there could be something to be said for let's reduce the periodontal bacteria by feeding food that genuinely cleans teeth, cleans the microbiome, has, keeps the dog healthy, if you like, which I would say is fresh food, even if that's lightly cooked. And then we will see less periodontal disease, and we will have less transmission in terms of bacteria. So what I suggested to this lady is that we did a study. So what we're going to do is we're going to have about 90 dogs, and half will be fed a raw meal in front of us on a very sterile floor, because we'll think of all the variables, of course. And the kibble-fed dogs will be there too, and we'll swab after they've eaten, and we'll see. I mean, it might be that they're both identical, but we will see, because her preliminary evidence and her preliminary data has shown that the raw-fed dogs have less problem bacteria in their mouths. So.
Which, I mean, to be fair, if a dog's been fed like bacteria-rich food, like as long as they've got the right bacteria, you would think that would be the case, just on how bacteria works. Because obviously, I think it's like when I had Joe on and I was talking to Joe about good bacteria and bad bacteria. Yeah. Actually, like having stuff which has no bacteria is actually
sterile. Yeah, we don't want sterile.
We don't want sterile.
No,
like which
is what we get with shelf-stable food, or that's the aim.
Yeah,
doesn't, I think, probably get there, because you just can't have no bacteria.
Yeah,
everything has a life force to it of some degree, and that usually is the bacteria.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to ask you, like, this is
another criticism.
Yeah, no. So, okay. So one thing I would say is that raw feeding is not for everyone, and I think the problem with fresh food as well is if you're buying it commercially, it's damn expensive, and I can't think of a single company that's not subscription based either.
You're probably right there.
Which for me, as a specialist pet trade person, I hate.
Yes, it doesn't help pet stores at all.
It doesn't help it because if you want to be able to go out in the future and get your collar and lead and
I get that,
and get your supplements in an efficient way, you need to support your independent stores. And my issue with subscription-based companies is that it's the opposite. It's taking the meat and potatoes away from those stores, and so I'm all for getting people into stores, and getting buying out of stores. And look, I do use one subscription product. I use 𝐷𝐿, but that's because there's nothing else on the market which has a meat and insect base, and that works really well for one of my dogs. And so I like 𝐷𝐿. I like Harry. So it was, for me, it was, I was able, the
obvious choice.
I could choose it with that conscience, but in general, I want to buy things from pet stores.
Yeah.
Now, let's say raw food's not for you. Let's say you don't have freezer space. You're worried about, you've got small children, whatever your objection is. Because look, not everybody is in a position to fill up a freezer full of raw or go to the shop every day to pick up a pack, or, so they're going to have to make a shelf-stable decision. What can people do in terms of choosing the right shelf-stable decision? And also, I've chosen one which is within my budget. And I'm also, one thing you can say about, let's say, commercially produced foods is they're not crazy expensive, and not everybody is in an economic position to buy the best of the best of the best of the best. So what can we do to say, because look, a brand I do like in terms of dog foods, for example, would be Skinner's. I like Skinner's. I think it's a very good quality food for not a lot of money. But what can we do to make that better?
So you need bone broth.
Yeah,
bone broth.
No,
I mean, you've had Lara on talking about her bone broth. I mean, it is just it's just terrific. That you can't really get a better topper, to be honest, because it starts to actually heal the epithelial lining, which is what starts to degrade if the microbiome changes, and the microbiome becomes low diversity, which again, from Carol's data, is just dramatically happening on processed food. So bone broth will start to heal some of the issues that processed food could be creating inside the dog's gut.
And also when
it's very healthy as well.
And when it comes to a dog food, what in your opinion, what should people be looking for? Let's say I'm got to buy a shelf stable product. What should I be looking for, and what shouldn't I be looking for? Because obviously we all know that with kibble you lose a lot in the cooking process, and I think there's things people put in there, or a claim that's in there, which by the time it's had the granny cooked out of it, it ain't really that good. Or so, I mean, look, my argument used to be, was buy something mid-range, something good, something like a Skinner's, like something in that category. And I'm just saying Skinner's because it's something I would have bought in a certain monetary category if I was in that category. And then add some bits to it, because it's much cheaper to do that than to go origin, top of the market, and spend a fortune on the dog food. Because I believe Skinner's with some bone broth and some pumpkin powder or some kelp powder or some antler powder is superior to, let's say, going all out and buying the dearest dog food you can find, which might be double, triple the price.
Yes, a lot of it is just margin. Yeah, I'll agree with that with some of these. So, of course, it does depend on the dog, because it depends what the dog needs, you see. So you don't want anything that's got a high carb or a high grain content. So you need to be seeing meat as the first two, at least, if it is going to be broken down to this kind of fresh meat meal to other meat meal type thing. And I think sometimes you have to talk to consultants these days to actually know what's going on in the industry, or hope that the pet store that you go into will have done their due diligence. They will have spoken to the companies. They will have been to events like the Natural Dog Expo, and they will have learnt more about what's in the food. So, but if it is just down to the Guardian and they literally want to listen to this and they want to look on the back of the packet and go, what should I feed? you've got to have meat, as much meat in that. Now, sometimes with the cold press, in order to have a higher meat content in the overall product, but not have too high a protein, because obviously there's a protein there actually isn't necessarily a maximum on the guidelines, but they don't like to go over a certain amount. Companies, they will have the meat and bone meal. So obviously the bone is part of the meat, so that still gets. Now, things like this, you can only find out from someone like me because we've been in the manufacturing world. So the Guardian is never going to be able to find that out. So I might say, oh yes, have this cold pressed over that one. But my reasoning is something that the Guardian's never going to know unless they really follow all our podcasts and really do you see what I mean? So there's certain things. The other thing, what you want to do is you want to look at the additives, because the additives have been added in because the nutrients weren't in there. Okay, so if the additives are high, so if there's a high amount of vitamin A added, a high amount of zinc added, a high amount of magnesium and selenium added, that means there was less in the food to begin with. So that's not necessarily good. Also, when you look at these additives, if they say oxide, there's one particular brand which has got really good fun, natural looking, bordering on cartoon-like fun advertising, a fun name, one of these ands in the middle, and like it's your pet names. And that shelf-stable food is full of oxides, and I've seen it in health food shops. So basically, these are the least bioavailable version of a nutrient. So if you're going to add a nutrient into your processed food because it wasn't in there to begin with after the cooking stages, at least add it in an absorbable form. You see, so, avoid oxides. You don't see them that often, but I was really, really surprised to see it in the food I did see it in.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that it's so hard, isn't it, for people, because it's a minefield, like when you're looking at these things. I mean, look, I've been selling pet food my whole life, and yet, there's lots of things I don't know about. Do you know what I mean? It's like, because it's so hard to stay up to date. And look, the people's the way people talk about things changes over time as well.
And dogs have changed.
Yeah.
Dogs were more resilient to not having decent food.
Yeah.
And now they're not, because generationally, of course, they don't live that long really in the grand scheme of things. So we've got maybe 3 or 4 or 5 generations in our lifetimes, and they're not as healthy because they're not born a blank canvas. So if their parents weren't had optimum nutrition, and their organs weren't as efficient as they could have been, and they weren't detoxing, the pups are going to be the same. So they're born with less resilience to then having less nutrition or low diversity microbiome.
I know, and obviously you said about the grain thing. And
it's not ideal. It's not ideal.
Yeah, so that was a big thing that changed in sort of mid 2000s, was it went from everyone was using wheat or corn or something like that, and now suddenly everyone's using sweet potatoes, white potatoes, but
lentils,
like peas.
Yeah. Oh, a lot of peas. Yeah. Although that's more used for protein content, actually.
Well, it's used to protein bolster, and I actually balk against high pea protein products because obviously niacin's not great, and when it gets to the point you're putting 20% peas in the diet, you think, what the hell is going on? Do you know what I mean? It's like...
And peas can very easily have something called free-form glutamate in it when they're made into a pea protein powder. So you have to watch that as well, because you'd end up with MSG.
Yeah. So if you look at these different carbohydrates, because obviously we know meat is good, meat is meat, different types. I think chicken is probably the one which has the most problems behind it. But when we look at carbohydrates, people tend to focus on the carbohydrate difference, like the grain-free thing. What would you say the benefits are between, let's say, when you look at sweet potato or tapioca, and then you compare it against wheat and corn? And is it worth the money? Because you're paying a lot of money for sweet. White potatoes, for example, they call it grain-free, but white potatoes ain't no good in my book for dogs. So it's like, when you're buying the grain-free, you're paying extra money at the counter for it. Is there a point?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the reasons is because the alternatives do tend to feed the biome better. So you will have we should at least have a better diversity if you're feeding something that's using those ingredients instead of grain. So it's not the fact it's grain-free, it's the fact they're in it instead of the grain. But also metabolically, dogs aren't biologically designed to take energy from excessive amount of carbs. And there's a fantastic book by Dr. Richard Patton, Nottingham University Press. It's pretty difficult to get hold of. And it's what's it called now? Something, I can picture it. It's orange with a big, huge Labrador on the front of it. Something about excess, anyway. And it's a fantastic book. If you look up what he's written, you'll find it. And this explains exactly what's happening metabolically with our pets and how they take energy from fats in a different way, how they're better able to perform something called gluconeogenesis. And they have learned to adapt in a different way as carnivorous beings. And probably if we studied the other carnivorous beings in the same way, we would find that they do the same things to create their energy. So for them to have too many carbs and too many grains, it initially sends insulin spiking, which would then end up becoming a little bit of insulin resistant. It can start a cascade, which would include leptin resistance as well. And all these things are related to how the dog feels and also the dog laying fat in the body. So metabolically, it just doesn't suit the dogs to have great volumes of this. And this is all biology. This is all proven. It doesn't even need to be proven. It's just original biology of how the dog's body actually works. So there seems to be a huge kind of overlook for me in terms of the metabolic rates of the dogs and the cats. And I'm not talking calories, because that's a different thing altogether, but just the basic metabolic rates. Because actually, the dog's body has 8 ways of raising its blood sugar, but only 1 to bring it down. And that's the insulin. So evolutionary, you can see then that they have developed over the years 8 ways to raise the blood sugar. So we are feeding them too much. Perfected by lack. That's the name of the book. Okay. Perfected by lack. Must have excess in the second bit. So yeah. So essentially, we're not necessarily feeding them too much if we're feeding fresh food, like you feed them the volume you're supposed to feed, but we're feeding them too much in terms of what their metabolism can handle when we're giving them the processed food. And on top of that, when you feed them the processed food, the essential fatty acids and the smaller fatty acids, they are not the kind that would make something or encourage something like ATP to happen as easily in the body. So you're not giving them the fuel they need then when you're feeding them the processed food, as well as giving them all this excess metabolic stuff. Do you see what I mean? So it's never just necessarily about what you are giving them, it's about what you're not giving them as well. Yeah.
Another thing I read, the funny thing is like there was like a myth going around years ago about how you couldn't feed raw with kibble.
Oh yeah.
And you had to feed cold pressed because it goes at the same rate and all this, and absolute nonsense. Like,
yeah.
But one thing I do think, I mean, what's your opinion? Because obviously, one thing that has been proven is that if you are a kibble feeder and you give a small addition of raw, that it will actually like really help the gut's microbiome, like enormously. Now,
oh yes, the Finland studies.
Yeah, I mean, what's your opinion on that?
I totally believe those studies.
Yeah.
Yeah, because instantly what you're doing, one of the first things that starts to happen when you add whole foods into the diet, and this will be whatever diet the dog is eating, you start to add some whole foods of some kind, especially if they're meat-based, you encourage the stomach to, in a sense, what it's doing is it's like a type of peristalsis. So it's moving in and out. So it's churning and chewing, essentially, because the reason dogs gulp their food is because they don't have digestive enzymes in their mouth in the same way we do. So they have to gulp it down because that's where the digestive enzymes are. And the stomach churns and chews, or it's meant to. And as it does, it releases more stomach acid. So it becomes healthier and more able to deal with bacteria. That's what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And also more able to break down food. So when the dog is eating a processed food, you tend to find that that doesn't happen because it disintegrates far easier. It doesn't require the chewing. It's a bit like putting something in your mouth that melts in the mouth. So what you're essentially ending up with is a dog with an under par stomach that we would call a sensitive stomach dog. So as soon as you add that fresh food on top, you're encouraging the optimal stomach condition. So you will start, you would like to think you'd start to get a healthier dog. Yeah. One of the reasons. It's not going to be the only reason, I'm sure.
But it's a bit like, the analogy I use is the difference between eating, let's say, a pound of burgers and a pound of steak, really, in ourselves. If you eat a pound of burgers, you'll still be hungry. Whereas if you eat a pound of steak, you wouldn't be. You wouldn't be. And it's to do with how the body actually processes it.
Yeah, the fibres of the meat, talking of fibre.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like just how it, like the fact that your body has to work to break it down.
Yeah.
Whereas you eat like stuff that's already been ground and minced and like played with. Your body
to a degree. I mean, we would chew more in our mouth though, but it's a similar process.
Yeah. Right, so let's talk about your Natural Dog Expo. Tell me, how did that come about, and tell me all about it, because I know amongst some of the people I know, it's very popular, and you have some great people sort of like backing it. Obviously, I know you have Lucille, you have Ingenious Probiotics.
Yep, Joe at Ingenious Probiotics. I know. Lara goes every time that you've interviewed Lara.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also what I've done this year, rather than having a corporate sponsor, you'll be pleased about this. I've actually had a group of stores come to me, and they've said, we're going to club together and we're going to take that sponsorship. And so we're supporting the stores.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say it's the podcast. You're doing it just as a big
we're
fan.
not. No competition.
God, no.
No, we're supporting the stores because really they're the ones, as you know, that do the hard work, and they see people on a daily basis, and they're faced with these sort of criticisms like you threw at me earlier. Like, they have to deal with this all the time. So they love these events because they get to learn what to say.
Yeah, and it's so important. Like, and because that's the thing, is that this is why obviously I bang on all the time about supporting independent stores, because that's the people who will go out and get learn the proper things to do. They will give people solutions to their problems. They will have the supplements behind the counter. Yeah. So if your dog comes to you and it's got acid reflux, and you say, well, use slippery elm with marshmallow root, saves you a trip to the vet, or they'll buy, you've got an ear infection, you give them the Ingenious Probiotics. There's lots of stuff that a store can do, which is so helpful to people, which you won't get out of online, and you won't get out of big corporates, and this is why it's so important to support, because look, they've been squeezed in every direction. When I started wholesaling in the 90s, there was no competition really from discounters. There was no competition from online. There was no subscription services. Like, supermarkets were there, but it was all Pedigree and Nestle and that sort of stuff. Whereas now it's so competitive, and they're getting squeezed in every single direction, like on every single part. And it's so important we support them, because if you want that information, if you want people who actually keep the stuff in stock that you can give a crap about, we really need to get behind these people.
Yeah, it's more of a personal approach, definitely, and that is who we truly are as human beings. We should be meeting each other. We shouldn't be in separation. We should be in unity, and we should be supporting each other and shopping local for sure. Yeah, definitely, that's all part of it. Yeah,
because when you don't have it anymore, it's a big loss.
Yes, we miss it when it's gone, wouldn't we?
So tell me about the show anyway, because I'm sidetracking.
Don't go to a pet shop on the Sunday the 27th of April, because they'll all be at my event. So they'll all be in Solihull watching the speakers. We've got some fantastic speakers.
So tell us all about it.
The speakers that we've got this year, Dr. Conor Brady. So he has lots to say. Really great at finding
pet medics guy, right?
Yeah, he's really great at finding science behind fresh food as well. So he's really, really interesting and fun to listen to. He's got a good sense of humour. So he's coming over from Ireland to speak. We've got Dr. Sue Armstrong. Now, she is one of the most prolific, really, homeopathic vets. and she has taught or inspired at least a lot of the other holistic vets that we know. So she's going to be full of information for us all, talking about dealing with chronic disease. So not acute things that happen and what do we do in that immediate moment, but how do we avoid and how do we deal with chronic disease? So she's got lots to say about that. Brilliant lady. Also, Carol from the Microbiome Lab that I've been talking about today. Yep. She's back by popular demand because her talk was really hotly discussed after the last expo last year. So yeah, she's back. Also, I'm giving a talk about water and the value of water with one of my students, Scott. So we're going to be doing that together. He's as obsessed with water as I am.
𝐕𝐈𝐃𝐄𝐒, is it like those sort of things?
Yeah, the verses again.
Yeah. Highland Spring
versus Solihull tap water. Yeah. That would be an easy talk. Do you taste the difference? We've got Sherry Scott, who is founder of the IAAT, so that's like the animal therapy organisation. But she's coming to talk for us. She doesn't really do talks anymore because she's 80 plus now. Oh, wow. But she, again, has got a really good sense of humour, and she's going to talk to us about pain relief for dogs and also some of her experiences in the past. So that should be fun. And finally, the biggie, I've managed to get Rodney Habib to come over. Do you know Rodney Habib? He's from the USA or Canada, really. So he's coming over. He's one of the most well-known on social media. So he's very much on the social media platforms, not necessarily the LinkedIn. Yeah. So yeah, he's coming over. He's flying over. So it's going to be a really good day. Yeah, We've got lots going on.
I did look through the lineup, and it's a pretty impressive lineup, to be fair.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
It's going to be a pretty jam-packed day.
It will be a jam-packed day. Yes, I've also got the local gospel choir coming for just after lunch, because you always need something to kind of get people uplifted again after their tuna sandwiches. So, they're coming in.
They're coming in with some crates of lager.
Yeah. Send everyone to sleep in the middle of Connor's talk. Yeah. So, I just want it to be happy. Yeah. But that's my thing about that event, is make it a happy, friendly, high vibe event. It's only for the day. Yeah. So we enjoy it. Yeah. Yeah. Make sure we enjoy it and uplift everybody.
And there's still tickets available.
There are only the delegate ones though. The VIPs have all gone. Yeah. Yeah. What date will this go out?
It'll be probably in the next 2 weeks. Well, I can play it whenever, and either the week after next, the week after that, or the week after that.
Okay, so there's. Where was I? What was I saying? Oh, the delegate tickets. Yeah. Okay. The early pause, I think, is finished now, as we do this. So what I'll do, actually, for your audience, I'll do them a code. I'll do them a code for some money off a ticket. And then if you put it out in the comments or whatever that might be, and then they just put that in at checkout and they'll get £30 off a ticket.
All right, awesome. Yeah, no, wicked. And so Caroline, if people want to get hold of you about anything, so if they want to talk about consultancy or just anything you do, what's the best way of getting hold of you?
So Canine Holistic Science Academy. It's a bit of a mouthful, but canineholistic.scienceacademy.com is my website.
And that's canine as in C-A-N.
As in the Latin. So C-A-N-I-N. Yeah.
Not K and
Not K and an I, no. So that's, so I run courses. So I teach canine nutrition. I've got about 90 students. In fact, I've won an award of Animal Tutor of the Year.
Awesome.
Yeah, as well. So... yeah, so I'm an award-winning tutor.
Wow.
It's great. I didn't think I went in for it. I just thought, I'll go in for it. Didn't think I'd actually
someone's got to win.
The award.
Someone's got to win, isn't there? I mean,
thanks for that.
I mean, I got my 50-metre swimming award once. So,
it's the first time I've won anything except a raffle when I was younger. And I never forget. I remember I looked at this, what you could win. And one of them was this big, like, Dulux dog toy thing. And it was like almost as big as me because I was only about 6. And I was staring at it going, I really, really want that. Didn't know about, all these visualization techniques that I talked about. Didn't know about that back then. And and I won.
Yeah.
And I'm going off with this, but I just never forget because I don't win much. So it's great.
As a young child, you're like, I don't know how to feed this thing properly. And, and ever since, here we are.
I think the dog we had probably actually went inside and took its insides out and all sorts probably. So I don't know if it lasted that long, but yeah, it was great at the time.
Right. Thanks a million for coming in, Karen. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for having me. It's been fun.
All right. Cheers.